So, welcome back to Ev on Everything for episode number 2, which is called The Wind Rises. Now, half of Ev on Everything is about politics. Politics, economics, current affairs, the kind of things that are going on in our lives and in the world from day to day that affect us and that affect everyone. But the other half of Ev on Everything is about culture, popular and otherwise. It's about the things that we do for and about each other. And we're going to try to make the Tuesday shows politics and the Friday shows culture. After a long week, I think both you and I are going to want a show that's about something other than the crushing realization that everything that's happening in reality is really happening. The culture shows are going to try to reach a little beyond being just reviews or opinion pieces. They're going to say a bit more about the wider world and society. So if you haven't seen or read or know about the thing that it's on, the idea is that it's still appealing. Okay? Don't get scared off by it being about culture with a capital C. I'm as interested in movies that have more than one Jean-Claude Van Damme in them as I am in the cultural resonance of Dutch Baroque painting. Though both are good. The Low Countries do high culture well in both cases. Culture with a capital C is more than just legitimate high-end culture. And every Friday I'm going to take some bit of that culture, movie, album, an artist or an author, or even a sport or a hobby, and I'm going to do a show about it. And I'm going to try to take it somewhere fun and interesting. If you've always wanted the London Review of Books to cover a UFC title fight, this is for you. But if you've wanted somebody who has strong opinions on the verifiable fact that Burnout Takedown is better than SSX Tricky to talk about John Coltrane records, this is also the show for you. We're going to try to make it fun and enjoyable for all concerned, whether or not you know the culture that we're talking about. Okay, before we begin, we are going to talk about spoilers. Okay? We're going to specifically talk about the fact that I hate spoiler culture and I hate people who moan about spoilers all the time. Sometimes it seems like you can't even mention Sunset Boulevard without somebody being annoyed that you said there's a guy dead in a pool. I mean, it happens 2 minutes into the movie and they tell you who it is and what he's doing there in the opening monologue, but some people just hate the idea that they might know something about a film or a book or whatever before they read it, as if there's nothing to it except for the plot. That's really weird and I don't like it. There's so much more to culture and everything about it than just knowing what happens. So that's why I'm trying to pitch this both as something where you don't need to know what happens. You're going to enjoy it anyway. And also something where if you find out a little bit about the movie or the book or whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to tell you who Kaiser Soze is, and I'm not going to tell you what Jake was being told to forget about because it's just Chinatown. You know? Don't worry about spoilers. They're not really relevant, and you don't need to know them in order to enjoy this. Anyway, the movie that we're going to kick off with, and we are kicking off with a movie, is called The Wind Rises. It's one of my favorite films of all time, and it's one that hasn't been available to stream until very recently. And since we're all locked away from the rest of the world, a streaming movie I think is a good opening. Better than, say, reviewing a bar you can never go to, or giving you my thoughts on wild swimming in beautiful lochs in Scotland that you're literally forbidden from driving to. A streaming movie is something we can all enjoy together, right? And The Wind Rises is one of the best that you will find anywhere. It's on Netflix right now. It's a film about an aircraft designer, and it's made by the famed Studio Ghibli, the animation studio from Japan that's been massively influential on modern animation of all kinds. And it is an incredible movie. If you have access to it, I want you to just go and watch it. You don't need to watch it to enjoy this show, but my God, it is so good that you should drop everything and just go and do it. Okay? But if you don't know what it is, if you haven't seen it, don't worry, because this is a movie with huge resonances beyond just itself. And we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff around the film, more so even, I think, than the film itself. We're going to be talking about the history of Japan, because it's set in the period immediately leading up to the Second World War. We're going to be talking about national and personal guilt. We're going to be talking about pacifism. And we're going to be talking about the appropriateness of recognizing the lives and achievements of people who do things like design weapons. Okay? We're also going to be talking about a flying pig. An actual flying pig, like a pig that flies an airplane. That's not in The Wind Rises, but it is in the show, and we're going to deal with it in just a moment. But before that, we've got to do the podcast dance. So bear with me for one moment. Okay, so a lot of people listen to this show in their internet browsers. I don't know why. I haven't worked out what it is that does it, but a lot of people are not listening through podcast apps and they're not listening on their phones. I think they're getting sent links by people, which is great. I love that there's people sharing the show and giving it to people, and I love that there's people finding it in random corners of the internet and listening. You know, it's brilliant. But I'm here to tell you today that listening in a browser doesn't help the show grow and progress. Okay? What helps the show grow and progress is feedback and ratings and likes and shares in podcast apps. Because all the charts, all the algorithms, everything that makes the show popular happens in the podcast apps. And I thought it bore explaining, because a lot of the time you're just told, like and share and subscribe. Maybe it's worth explaining why that's important. If someone presses play in a web browser, sure, I find out that a stream happened. So does my podcast provider. So does anyone who's kind of analyzing the show, maybe an advertiser or something like that. Somebody who's putting together podcast ratings lists. They don't know, though, anything about that listen. Okay? And in order to use those algorithms to grow the show, I want you to go to a podcast app that collates this stuff and hit the like button, the 5-star button, or preferably the subscribe button. And if you've got a little bit of time on your hands, leave a review, even if it's just a sentence saying that you enjoy the show. These things matter a massive, massive amount. So I know that there are dozens and hundreds of people all over the world who listen to this show by clicking on a link in a tweet or anything like that. I love it. Thank you so much for listening. But if you can, make 1 or 2 more clicks or taps, open a podcast app of your choice and give it a rating, give it some stars and give it a share or whatever you like. It helps me a great deal. It's all I ask of you in return for me making this show. And making this show takes a huge amount of my time and effort. So in return, please just reach out to your podcast app or to somebody near you and recommend the show for me. Anyway, back to flying pigs. Okay, so this pig, a flying pig. 20 years before The Wind Rises, which was released in 2013, there was Porco Rosso. It's directed by Hayao Miyazaki, the same guy who made The Wind Rises, and it's set in the Adriatic Sea in islands off what's now Croatia. Okay? It was set in the late 1920s. At the time, it was the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. As you might guess from the title, the film is about a pig called the Red Pig, or the Crimson Pig, and he flies a red flying boat, and he fights air pirates. And air pirates fly these giant flying boats, and they prey on the shipping around the Adriatic. The film's really simple. The plot revolves around Porco Rosso being challenged by an American pilot who works for the air pirates, and Porco's relationships with women, and that's about it, right? But the aircraft are the point, okay? They are weird and wonderful and exceptionally beautiful, as befits a film by a man whose father worked for an aircraft manufacturer in Japan, okay? On Twitter, at Ev on Everything, I'm going to put some examples of late 1920s seaplanes up, racing seaplanes. They used to compete in cup competitions and races. They're very real, even if they seem completely fantastical in the film. There is a character called Curtis, and he flies a Curtis R3C aircraft, which was a real aircraft. It was a real racing seaplane, right? Porco's seaplane is referred to as a Savioa S21, but it resembles a cross between that plane and a Machi M39, which basically just shows that Miyazaki loves early aircraft design. Everything in the film is real or very closely based on reality, and everything in it is very lovingly crafted and recreated. There are depictions of World War I fighters, these kind of filigree fine biplanes of wire and wood that are incredibly fragile with open cockpits. The recreations are so enthusiastic, and this will become very important in understanding The Wind Rises. The film also adores Europe. It is extremely Europhile, which I find really refreshing. You know, in a time of Brexit, it's so nice to see Europe depicted as this wonderful, beautiful place. It's all blue skies and puffy clouds and beautiful seas. It's all gorgeous islands. The people are beautiful, you know? It's an idealized outsider's perspective, but it's a very informed one. Miyazaki visited Europe many times. He set other films there. Kiki's Delivery Service, which is about witches, but is set in Austria or Germany or somewhere along those lines, somewhere Germanic anyway. Sherlock Hound is set in England, and Laputa Castle in the Sky. It was inspired by mining strikes in Wales, which is, you know, it's something that Miyazaki witnessed, you know, firsthand, and it shows that it's not just picture postcard stuff. Porco Rosso is also very anti-fascist, and that's also very important. These days, which is scarcely believable, anti-fascist activism is often questioned. You know? It's hard to believe. There are people out there who, when somebody goes after the fascists, they go, hold on a second, are we sure we don't hate the anti-fascists as much as we hate the fascists? This kind of equivocating, you know? And it's natural to be happening now because the media in general criticizes leftist politics quite a lot, okay? Whether you agree with those politics or not, the criticism is plain to see, and there's no conspiracy to this, you know. A lot of the people who own and control large media outlets do well out of more right-wing, more capitalist programs, okay? Again, whether or not you believe that that's the right way to run an economy, facts are facts. And they often come out against left-wing politics. But what's happened is this has been transmogrified in popular culture into this idea that leftist politics are some way bad. So when you're out there, you know, blowing whistles and lighting flares and protesting against fascism, you're often equated with fascists themselves. And this is insane, right? People who are trying to stop fascism taking hold of a country are lined up along with the people who want to be out there, kicking in the heads of minorities because they're literal fascists, And we saw literal fascists quite often they've arisen in American politics, in Eastern European politics. Again, this is not conspiracy stuff, it's a matter of record. So when you hear Porco Rosso state very simply, I'd rather be a pig than a fascist, that's really refreshing, Some things maybe there shouldn't be so much nuance in. And anti-fascism, I think, is one of those things. If someone's a fascist, that's it. Done. Over. No discussion, no debate, no nuance. Fascism is wrong. Fascism is bad for everybody. And it should be resisted wherever it's found. Right? This is not a right or left wing thing. I don't care what you think about, quantitative easing or bailouts for large corporations or taxation rates on, money transfers or things like that. That's not the point. Fascism is wrong, and Porco knows it's wrong. Okay? Fascist Italy is encroaching on the Dalmatian Islands where the kind of film is set. Okay? Fascist Italy is bad. And it is a lack of nuance that I think could be instructive to a lot of more contemporary films or more contemporary commentaries. But the lack of nuance is very important when we get into The Wind Rises, because The Wind Rises is very nuanced. And one of the criticisms that was leveled at it is that maybe it's not such a good thing to be nuanced about Imperial Japan. But Miyazaki is nuanced about it. And it's important that we have laid a groundwork with Porco Rosso of absolute childlike adoration for aircraft design and of opposition to both fascism and to warfare in general. Miyazaki is often reported as being a pacifist, and he's made comments in opposition to changes to the pacifist parts of Japan's constitution, right? Japan has a constitution that it's illegal, essentially. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's illegal, essentially, to use war as a tool of foreign policy in Japan, okay? Changes to that by the Shinzo Abe government were resisted by a lot of Japanese people, Miyazaki was one of them. And seeing that he doesn't like the idea of, well, I suppose, war of any kind, but in a more nuanced way, the subversion of the wonderful things that humanity can build and be into instruments of war. Porco Rosso says overtly that he's not fighting a war here when he's offered more powerful ammunition for his machine gun. He would view himself as a bounty hunter who's doing a job. He doesn't kill anyone in the course of the movie. He's not an avenging angel here. He's not interested in killing people. He's shown to be somebody who will try to simply damage an opponent's aircraft and force them down rather than kill them, The people who are interested in killing are portrayed as uncouth. And again, that's very important when it comes to try to understand The Wind Rises, which is set at the same time as Porco Rosso, but there's no magical pigs in The Wind Rises. It is set in Japan, and it runs from the end of World War I to the start of World War II. Okay? That covers the period that Porco Rosso is set in. But it doesn't have this encroaching fascism, and it doesn't have such a simple stand taken against any kind of warfare. But it does talk about it being Imperial Japan and what the aircraft involved might be used for. Okay? So when we talk about The Wind Rises, we should always keep in mind that in Porco Rosso, we see Miyazaki's love of aircraft and opposition to fascism and warfare stated plainly. Every time that somebody brings up nuance as a justification for criticizing The Wind Rises, how can you be nuanced about these things? You can point them at Porco Rosso to say, actually, we know this guy's views. They're very plainly stated here, you know? So where you see nuance, you don't need to extrapolate from that equivocation. Equivocation is what people do on Twitter when they want to pretend that anti-fascists are similar to fascists. Equivocation is not what Miyazaki does when fascists come up. Then you'd prefer to be a pig than a fascist. It's refreshing. Anyway, that's Porco Rosso. It's a beautiful film. You should definitely check it out. But if you can't or if you don't, I will have some stuff up on Ev on Everything on Twitter so you can see some of these designs that I'm talking about. They are so beautiful and so wonderful. You will lose yourself in weird and amazing early aircraft designs. And we're going to do a little bit more of that later in the show when we talk about the designs that are at the center of The Wind Rises. The Wind Rises is about a historical figure, Jiro Horikoshi. He designed one of the most famous or infamous aircraft in history, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. If you know that aircraft, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know it, what we're basically going to be talking about here is what are the rights and wrongs, the ins and outs, and the nuances of making a sympathetic film that shows a person in a positive light if that person created one of the most decisive and devastating weapons of war in history. And if that weapon of war was made for the bad guys. So The Wind Rises. It's a historical drama. It covers a great sweep of Japanese history over about 3 decades from 1918 to 1945. It is stunningly beautiful. It is absolutely the first thing you have to say about the film. The detail, the realization, the colors, everything about it is so absolutely sumptuous. You want to just stop the movie constantly to drink in the scenery. The level of detail is just breathtaking, whether it's a landscape or an aircraft in a hangar or a domestic scene or an action scene. It is truly exceptional. The interiors look like something out of Vermeer or something like that. It is literally amazing. And if you just watched it to look at it, you would get more than the worth of your time and money to do it. It is absolutely wonderful. The film concerns the life of Jiro Horikoshi. He's an aircraft designer, and he's a real person who really lived. It weaves together kind of 3 strands: Jiro's personal life, his professional life, and the Japanese history of the time. Now, his personal history is taken from fiction, okay, or fictionalized fact. There's a novel called The Wind Rises, and it concerns a man whose fiancée is dying of tuberculosis, okay, in Japan. And that tuberculosis epidemic was real, okay? There was a lot of tuberculosis infection and a lot of death due to tuberculosis at this time in Japan, okay? But the book isn't about Jiro, all right? It's separate. It's been woven together and it makes the whole thing fictional. Okay. Then there's his professional life, and that's factual. Okay. Every plane that's mentioned in the film is real. Everything that is built by Jiro was really his project. And the people that he collaborates with, or the companies that he collaborates with, those collaborations really happened, and they'll become important later in the discussion. Then there's the Japanese history of the time, and that is equally factual. Okay. The most important individual kind of event in the movie is probably the Great Kanto earthquake from 1923. Would have happened right when Jiro Horikoshi was at university, and indeed it does appear in the movie at the right time in the right place. And the history of Japan forms a backdrop, just like a great historical epic Hollywood movie. Okay. You're telling the story of the country at the same time that you're telling the story of the characters. This is something that's key to understanding the moral center of this film, because the experience of Japanese people is set against the experience of the Japanese nation or the Japanese empire as it was at the time. So right then, Japan was invading Manchuria, it was invading the rest of China, Southeast Asia, it was expanding. Okay. The Second World War for Japan began a long time before Pearl Harbor. And it depicts that not directly, okay? You don't get scenes of Japan storming into Manchuria and killing Chinese people. Equally, you don't get scenes of the massacres that allegedly happened in the aftermath of the Kanto earthquake, massacres of Koreans, massacres of Chinese people. Okay? The prism through which we see Japanese history is the experience of ordinary Japanese people, and it's a bad experience. They are poor and downtrodden. They are disaffected. Many of them are dejected, fatalistic. Many of them express personal opinions that say, why are we bothering to do any of this weapon development or aircraft design when people are dying of poverty or when we can't possibly win the war? It's important to understand out in the world, Japan is doing terrible, terrible things. But at home in Japan, terrible things are happening to Japanese people. And the film basically, it carves a pretty straight line through Jiro's life. Okay, we start with his childhood, where he dreams of becoming an aircraft engineer. And then we move on to his student years, then his professional life, and finally his reflections on how everything turned out with regard to the Second World War and what happened to Japan. Okay? It's a wonderful story. All right? It's a beautifully realized, expertly told, engaging, heartbreaking story. You would be really remiss if you skipped this one because you thought it was about, boring machines, or if you thought that you wouldn't agree with the history as told. It opens with a dream sequence, and it works as a very clear thesis statement. A boy dreams of flying in a fantastical flying machine of his own design. He meets the great Caproni, an Italian aircraft designer of great renown, who's going to be a key moral focus of the movie. And he sees a giant aircraft above him that seems like a bacillus, seems to be propelled through the air by beating cilia. And its pitch black aircrews destroy the boy's aircraft and prevent him from flying. Okay? Naturally, the boy is Jiro, and he does grow up to be the gifted aircraft designer we're talking about. But his childhood is quite idyllic in spite of the poverty. Okay, it's a traditional childhood. He wears a traditional hakama, the divided skirt like trousers. He wears geta, the wooden sandal clogs. He uses jujutsu on a bully, and importantly, pontificates afterwards that fighting is never justified. It's a traditional outlook that will shift, okay, as the film develops and moves on. Not just the fashion and the design will change, but the music will follow as well, and the whole film will modernize along with Japan. The early parts of the film are filled with foreshadowing. You know, the bacillus quite obviously is a harbinger of tuberculosis. That's, really on the nose, but it works very well. Then the Great Kanto earthquake is also a harbinger because you can imagine what it's redolent of: the cataclysmic destruction of an entire Japanese city, right? Well, it's depicted beautifully in keeping with the gorgeous aesthetic of the film, but it also looks a lot like a shadow moving across the land, and it looks a lot like if you've ever seen the wind sweep across a meadow or a field, and you can see the color and the shape of the grass change as the front of the gust of wind moves. And it's very redolent of something that's going to come up over and over again thematically and visually in the film, which is the wind. Okay. We get, as far as I could count, a triple meet cute between Naoko, Jiro's love interest, and and Naoko himself via the wind. Okay, the first time Jiro's hat blows off and Naoko catches it. And the second time he tries to fly a plane to her balcony, a little paper airplane or a wooden model, and it gets caught by the wind. And he has to try again, but when he tries again and tries really hard, the wind carries it to her. The wind showing him the direction of his life, his future, and his potential is a repeated theme throughout. Okay. But there's another whole thematic aspect to the film that's not about the history of Japan, and it's not about the beauty of flight or of nature. It's about fascism. Okay. And here we see why Porco Rosso is an important introduction to understanding this movie. Okay. Caproni, the great aircraft designer, worked during World War One, and he saw his inventions changed or subverted into machines of war. And he tells Jiro how to live with that. Okay? But Jiro living with that is contrasted directly with someone who refused to live with that in the face of perhaps the only thing worse than Imperial Japan at the time. Someone who refused to make that compromise in the face of the Third Reich. To understand how you decide whether to work for Imperial Japan or refuse to work for Nazi Germany, we need to talk about aircraft design, because aircraft design is at the center of the entire film. The sheer joy and delight that these people take in flying machines is how we understand the choices that they make. Caproni, who is kind of like the moral compass of the film, is shown flying one of his CA-3 bombers. It's an amazing thing. It's like an open boat with four crew in kind of open cockpits. It's a massive biplane. So it's two huge wings stacked on top of each other with three different tail rudders at the back. The thing looks impossibly over-designed by modern standards. It looks ornate and intricate, and it shares more perhaps with a kind of a royal carriage design than with an aircraft, and it looks like it couldn't possibly fly. He designed one of the first airliners, a repurposed CA4, which is a bizarre triplane that's three wings stacked on top of each other, with again an open pilot cockpit on the central wing. And then suspended under that, hanging from it, is a gondola for the passengers, which sits above the lower wing. It had one of the first air disasters in 1919. One of them crashed and killed everyone on board. But even that bizarre triplane airliner wasn't his strangest or most ambitious design. In the movie, they show the CA60 Trans Aero, which you just have to see to believe it. And as usual, I'm going to put some photos of this thing up on Twitter, okay? At Ev on Everything. Go and look. This thing is ridiculous, incredible, and awesome in the real sense of the word. It's kind of like a flying barge, but a flying barge with 9 wings. That is three wing stacks. You know, one fore, one aft, and one amidships. It's got 8 engines. And not just 8 abreast the way you might expect in a modern aircraft. The 8 engines are arranged with 4 of them in a line on top of the fuselage, okay? That is 2 pulling and 2 pushing, 2 pointing forward and 2 pointing backward, and then 4 more out on the wings where you'd expect them to be, but not abreast. There's 2 in front and 2 at the back. And again, it's got open cockpits for the pilots, but it's also got open cockpits on top of the engines for flight engineers to service them in flight. It looks impossible. You know, it looks like it can't possibly be real, but it did fly. It flew twice. And it crashed and it was damaged while being salvaged and written off. And it's depicted in the film. It is the most ludicrous thing you could ever possibly see. But in a way, it's got this crazy, ugly beauty to it. This sort of lashed together, jury-rigged kind of... it looks a little bit homemade, you know? And in a way it was. That CA4 triplane, the first or one of the first airliners, 3 of them were cannibalized to make the one CA60 Trans Aero, and it looks like it's made out of parts. But it also, in a way, looks kind of elegant, a little bit like a sailing ship, with all of these complex rigged flight surfaces below which is suspended this fuselage full of passengers. It is in its own way very beautiful, but you have absolutely got to see it. And you can see how much the movie loves it, and you can understand how much a child looking at what Caproni was achieving would be awestruck by this and inspired by it. So the other antecedent of Jiro Horikoshi is Hugo Junkers. And Junkers was a German aircraft designer almost exactly contemporary with Caproni. He created the Junkers J1 in 1915. That is the first all-metal plane of any kind anywhere. The first time that somebody built a plane out of a hollow metal frame, which is really important to the plot of The Wind Rises, because Japan cannot do the same even 15 years later. It was a decade before America or Russia managed to do it either. Junkers was miles ahead of his time. He was building aircraft that, with a few modifications, like maybe a retractable undercarriage, could easily pass for World War II technology. He then pioneered using corrugated aluminium for structural strength in the skin of the aircraft. But what's most important for the film is he built a plane called the G-38. This was in 1929, and it's another one that just has to be seen to be believed. It was the biggest land-based aircraft of the time, and it was a blended wing, that is, an aircraft that the wings kind of blend into the body of the aircraft, and there's no great aerodynamic distinction between the two. That's an incredibly modern idea. It was being played around with in the Second World War, but didn't really become reality until much, much later. The G38 has 4 immense engines, and it has double passenger decks, and incredibly, it's got seating for passengers inside the wings. The leading edge of the wings have glass windows, and you can sit in the wing in between the engines while the plane is in flight. With a few styling updates with jet engines, it could easily be a plane from the 1950s or 1960s. Very, very easily. And very significantly for the plot of the film, there were only 2 built in Europe, but there were 6 built in Japan under license by Mitsubishi, who Jiro Horikoshi worked for. And it was Hugo Junkers, who we referred to earlier, who refused to work on aircraft for Nazi Germany. Jiro Horikoshi, understandably, is portrayed as looking up to these 2 giants of early aviation. He's shown developing the first Mitsubishi MF-10. Okay, this is a prototype fighter plane built for the Japanese Navy. Okay, it's all metal, and it has an extremely elegant design. It's all metal, and it is a little bit of an ugly duckling. It's kind of squat, and the way it performs is not really up to scratch. It's good, but it's not great, and it crashes in real life. Okay, the first Mitsubishi MF-10 did crash during trials, and it wasn't picked up by the Navy. But when he went on to build the prototypes for and the actual Mitsubishi A6M, this is a plane that did see service in the Second World War. He's really into building these extremely elegant, beautiful designs of all metal aircraft. The A5M has this inverted gull wing design, which is exceptionally beautiful. And it inspires most of the models that Jiro experiments with in the film. When he builds models out of wood or paper, they often have this kind of gull-winged profile. Okay, Jiro is fascinated by the beauty of flight and aerodynamics. He is fascinated by his predecessors, who were fascinated by the same things, and he sees things like the curves of wing sections in herringbones that are a kind of a natural beauty, an elegance that arises out of physics. Okay, and it's that elegance that makes the motivations of Jiro clear. It's what set the balance between Junkers and Caproni. Like his predecessors, Jiro, he basically sees the elegance of powered flight. And we need to understand that fascination and that regard in order to understand Jiro and the choices that he makes. So these beautiful aircraft, these amazing, inspiring machines, the dream Caproni tells Jiro it's okay to build aircraft like that. Even though they might get used as warplanes, the world is a better place, as he puts it, with pyramids in it. He wants humanity to build the wondrous, incredible things that they're capable of, even if other people might put them to nefarious use. And Caproni is very specific. He says he chooses to live in that world. This is not something that happens by accident. He doesn't make his planes and then, someone steals them from him and uses them for something else that he's not involved in. He knows what the world is. He knows how the world works, and he decides freely that he is going to contribute to that in order to also contribute to the good things that humanity he sees as needing. Okay, humanity should have these wondrous things. Caproni can build them, so he does. Hugo Junkers chooses not to live in that world. Okay? He's faced with the idea that he can contribute to the uh, success of Nazi Germany, and he decides not to. And he dies under house arrest by the Nazis. Okay? Now, there's a basic moral tension here, right? They're two bad nations gonna get into bad wars on the wrong side, on the losing side. Okay? Caproni sees that as okay to support because the broader sweep of the history of humanity is what you should be looking at, not the individual atrocities that might be levied against somebody with your inventions. And Hugo Junkers sees how bad the Nazis are immediately and says, I'm having nothing to do with that. Okay? And we know that this is bad, okay? Even though this is pre-war. When the movie goes to Germany, we see Germany as a drab place. Very, very different from the intensely beautiful Japan. Okay? They're both under totalitarian government. They're both expansionist. They're both dangerous, and they're both going to get into wars that are going to use or misuse these wondrous flying machines. But Japan is beautiful and Germany is not. When he goes to Germany, Jiro sees a Junkers G38 in all of its majesty, and he's inspired by it. And he sees the all-metal fighter plane designs too, and he's inspired by them. He even sees Junkers himself, though there's no kind of meeting between the two. And he goes home inspired, and he builds his planes. But he doesn't get away so easy. You know, it's not pure Caproni here. Jiro's visited by a mysterious German named Castorp. And Castorp warns him that Junkers is under pressure from the German authorities to build aircraft for Hitler. And he tells Jiro that the mountain retreat that they meet in is like their Zauberberg. That's the magic mountain of Thomas Mann. Okay? And it's a good place, he says, to forget bad things. Bad things like the things Jiro saw in Germany. You know, secret police chasing minorities, oppression. Miyazaki's also harking back to pre-Nazi German culture. He wants to point out the wonder and beauty of, you know, a great German novel. You know, Der Zauberberg is famously brilliant. And the beauty of the mountain and the magic of the mountain that Castorp and Jiro meet on is at odds with the drab, oppressive Germany that the film shows. And Jiro is literally told that being on a mountain up here, far away from all of the things that are going on in the world, allows you to take a more Caproni-like approach. You can think more about the beauty and wonder of the things that you're doing rather than any sort of moral questionability that might be there. Castorp's chased out of Japan by secret police, and Jiro's put on their list. So the totalitarianism is catching, you know? He's dipped a toe into the waters of maybe opposition. And Jiro is not faced with a neutral option of how to proceed. Okay? We're not told what he literally decides. Okay? There's no... the plot of the movie doesn't revolve around a crisis of confidence or conscience. Okay? But the existence of the movie itself is about that. Making this movie at all is about answering this question about whether it's okay to have made these machines in the first place, or whether it's okay to make the movie itself about the people who make the machines. And no wonder the movie comes down on the side that we should be making beautiful things, but at the same time, it is unflinching in how it presents the consequences of doing so. So, in 1945, at the end of the film, we see devastated Japan. Again, this is not spoiler stuff. We know how the Second World War turns out. Okay? We know what happens to Japan, and we know how horrifying it is. We also know that it's done by aircraft. Japan was never the subject of a ground invasion. Well, one or two islands were, but, you know, the main home islands of Japan were never invaded by people. They were bombed from the air. They were nuclear bombed, but they were also fire bombed. And there's a neat symmetry there between the earthquake at the start of the film and the firebombing at the end, because Jiro sees the aftermath of the Tokyo firestorm after the earthquake, and he sees how completely it destroys, almost erases the city. And at the end, he sees that not his planes, but maybe the conflict that his planes contributed to, and other people's planes, levied this kind of destruction on Japan deliberately. So he never had a neutral moral option, you know? There was always going to be some level of horror involved in what he was doing, but he did it anyway. And to sum up the kind of moral calculus of the film, what it's basically saying is that a dream of flight is such an incredibly wondrous thing. It is so beyond the normal experience of humanity, so magical and wondrous and amazing that we have to do it. If you're struck by this, if you become one of these dreamers of flight, you simply must answer the call. There aren't other options, you know? And in a way, it's absolutely right, because Hugo Junkers died in, house arrest, essentially. His wife sold all of the company's patents and assets and so on to the Nazis. And Junkers, as we said, went on to build some of the most important German aircraft of World War II, the Junkers Ju-87 and 88 bombers. So this all happened. Hugo Junkers chose his hill to literally die on, and it didn't change anything. Jiro didn't decide to die on that hill, and it didn't change anything. Japan was still bombed flat, and probably would have been no matter what Jiro himself did. And Caproni was going on family holidays out in bomber aircraft. In a dream, of course, but it seems clear that the moral calculus comes down on Jiro's side. You can't write yourself out of this aspect of human history. This is not going to go away if you ignore it. Instead, everything is going to happen anyway, but as Caproni puts it, humanity won't have any pyramids. And I suppose the thing to do is to invite yourself to look at all of these incredible, beautiful, wonderful flying machines and ask yourself if we'd be better off without them. They are really, really wonderful things. They're beautiful and elegant, technically wondrous. They are, in a way, uplifting. They'll lift you like the wind that the movie keeps returning to. And humanity as a whole can soar on that and become better. That's the whole idea here. And I suppose the film makes its point very well that we're all better off for the people like Hugo Junkers and Caproni and even Jiro. we're all better off that those people are out there seeing what we can do, seeing what we're capable of, seeing the future and going and grasping it. And if you're curious as to whether that makes Hayao Miyazaki an apologist for World War II Japan, then you watched a different movie than I did, because it answers the question very, very clearly. And Porco Rosso rams it home if you needed any reinforcement of how bad all of this stuff is and how terrible it is that all of humanity does it. Jiro doesn't get away free from this, but he does get to have his dream. Anyway, that's about enough for this edition of Ev on Everything. As I said a couple of times before, there's going to be a whole bunch of pictures of all of this stuff up on Twitter so that you can see everything that I'm describing in the show. And if you like it, I want you to, subscribe and share and all that stuff. And let me know what you thought on Twitter. Give me some feedback at Ev on Everything, or even find me myself at Ev Buckley. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week on Tuesday with a politics episode. Delighted that you stayed, delighted that you listened, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.